Chapter 7. The birth of Elizabeth Rowan Roffe was a double tragedy. The minor tragedy was that Elizabeth's mother had died on the delivery table. The major tragedy was that Elizabeth was born a girl. For 9 months, until she emerged from the darkness of her mother's womb, she was the most eagerly awaited child in the world, heir to the colossal empire, the multi-billion-dollar giant, Roffe and Sons. Sam Roffe's wife, Patricia, was a dark-haired woman of surpassing beauty. Many women had tried to marry Sam Roffe for his position, his prestige, his wealth. Patricia had married him because she had fallen in love with him. It had proved to be the worst of reasons. Sam Roffe had been looking for a business arrangement, and Patricia had suited his requirements ideally. There was no room in his life for anything but Roffe and Sons. He was fanatically dedicated to the company, and he expected no less from those around him. Patricia's importance to him lay solely in the contribution she could make to the image of the company. By the time Patricia came to the realization of what kind of marriage she had made, it was too late. Sam gave her a role to play, and she played it beautifully. She was the perfect hostess, the perfect Mrs. Sam Roffe. She received no love from her husband, and in time Patricia learned to give none. She served Sam, and was as much an employee of Roffe and Sons as the lowliest secretary. She was on call 24 hours a day, ready to fly wherever Sam needed her, capable of entertaining a small company of world leaders or serving a gourmet dinner to 100 guests on a day's notice, with crisp, heavily embroidered tablecloths, gleaming baccarat crystal, heavy Georgian silverware. Patricia was one of Roffe and Sons' unlisted assets. She worked at keeping herself beautiful, and exercised and dieted like a Spartan. Her figure was perfect, and her clothes were designed for her by Norel in New York, Chanel in Paris, Hartnell in London, and young Sybil Connolly in Dublin. The jewelry Patricia wore was created for her by John Schulenberger in Bulgaria. Her life was busy and full, and joyless and empty. Becoming pregnant had changed all that. Sam Roffe was the last male heir of the Roffe dynasty, and Patricia knew how desperately he wanted a son. He was depending on her, and now she was the queen mother, busy with the baby within her, the young prince, who would one day inherit the kingdom. When they wheeled Patricia into the delivery room, Sam clasped her hand and said, "Thank you." She was dead of an embolism 30 minutes later, and the only blessing about Patricia's death was that she died without knowing that she had failed her husband. Sam Roffe took time off from his grueling schedule to bury his wife, and then turned his attention to the problem of what he should do with his infant daughter. 1 week after Elizabeth was born, she was taken home and turned over to the nanny, the beginning of a long series of nannies. During the first 5 years of her life, Elizabeth saw very little of her father. He was barely more than a blur, a stranger who was always arriving or leaving. He traveled constantly, and Elizabeth was a nuisance who had to be carted along, like a piece of extra luggage. 1 month Elizabeth would find herself living at the Long Island estate, with its bowling alley, tennis court, swimming pool, and squash court. A few weeks later, her nanny would pack Elizabeth's clothes and she would be flown to her villa in Biarritz. It had 50 rooms and 30 acres of grounds, and Elizabeth kept getting lost. In addition, Sam Roffe owned a large duplex penthouse apartment on Beekman Place and a villa on the Costa Smeralda in Sardinia. Elizabeth traveled to all these places, shunted from house to apartment to villa, and grew up amid all the lavish elegance. But always she felt like an outsider who had wandered by mistake into a beautiful birthday party given by unloving strangers. As Elizabeth grew older, she came to know what it meant to be a daughter of Sam Roffe. Just as her mother had been an emotional victim of the company, so was Elizabeth. If she had no family life, it was because there was no family, only the paid surrogates and the distant figure of the man who had fathered her, who seemed to have no interest in her, only in the company. Patricia had been able to accept her situation, but for the child it was torment. Elizabeth felt unwanted and unloved, and did not know how to cope with her despair, and in the end she blamed herself for being unlovable. She tried desperately to win the affection of her father. When Elizabeth was old enough to go to school, she made things for him in class, childish drawings and watercolor paintings and lopsided ashtrays, and she would guard them fiercely, waiting for him to return from one of his trips, so that she could surprise him, please him, hear him say, "It's beautiful, Elizabeth. You're very talented." When he returned, Elizabeth would present her love offering, and her father would glance at it absently and nod, or shake his head. "You'll never be an artist, will you?" Sometimes Elizabeth would be awakened in the middle of the night and walk down the long winding staircase of the Beekman Place apartment and through the large cavernous hall that led to her father's study. She would step into the empty room as if she were entering a shrine. This was his room, where he worked and signed important pieces of paper and ran the world. Elizabeth would walk over to his enormous leather-topped desk and slowly rub her hands across it. Then she would move behind the desk and sit in his leather chair. She felt closer to her father there. It was as though by being where he was, sitting where he sat, she could become a part of him. She would hold imaginary conversations with him, and he would listen, interested and caring as she poured out her problems. One night, as Elizabeth sat at his desk in the dark, the lights in the room suddenly came on. Her father was standing in the doorway. He looked at Elizabeth seated behind his desk, clad in a thin nightgown, and said, "What are you doing here alone in the dark?" And he scooped her up in his arms and carried her upstairs to her bed, and Elizabeth had lain awake all night, thinking about how her father had held her. After that, she went downstairs every night and sat in his office waiting for him to come home and get her. But it never happened again. No one discussed Elizabeth's mother with her, but there was a beautiful full-length portrait of Patricia Roffe hanging in the reception hall, and Elizabeth would stare at it by the hour. Then she would turn to her mirror. Ugly. They had put braces on her teeth, and she looked like a gargoyle. No wonder my father isn't interested in me, Elizabeth thought. Overnight she developed an insatiable appetite and began to gain weight, for she had arrived at the wonderful truth. If she were fat and ugly, no one would expect her to look like her mother. When Elizabeth was 12 years old, she attended an exclusive private school on the east side of Manhattan in the upper 70s. She would arrive in a chauffeur-driven Rolls-Royce, walk into her classes and sit there, withdrawn and silent, ignoring everyone around her. She never volunteered to answer a question, and when she was called upon, she never seemed to know the answer. Her teachers soon got in the habit of ignoring her. They discussed Elizabeth among themselves, and unanimously agreed that she was the most spoiled child they had ever seen. In a confidential year-end report to the head mistress, Elizabeth's homeroom teacher wrote, "We have been able to make no progress with Elizabeth Roffe. She is aloof from her classmates and refuses to participate in any of the group activities. She has made no friends at school. Her grades are unsatisfactory, but it is difficult to tell if this is because she makes no effort or because she is unable to handle the assignments. She is arrogant and egotistical. Were it not for the fact that her father is a major benefactor of the school, I would strongly recommend expelling her." The report was light years from the reality. The simple truth was that Elizabeth Roffe had no protective shield, no armor against the terrible loneliness that engulfed her. She was filled with such a deep sense of her own unworthiness that she was afraid to make friends, for fear that they would discover that she was worthless, unlovable. She was not arrogant. She was almost pathologically shy. She felt that she did not belong in the same world that her father inhabited. She did not belong anywhere. She loathed being driven to school in the Rolls-Royce because she knew she did not deserve it. In her classes, she knew the answers to the questions the teachers asked, but she did not dare to speak out, to call attention to herself. She loved to read, and she would lie awake late at night in her bed, devouring books. She daydreamed, and oh, what lovely fantasies. She was in Paris with her father, and they were driving through the Bois in a horse-drawn carriage, and he took her to his office, an enormous room something like St. Patrick's Cathedral, and people kept walking in with papers for him to sign, and he would wave them away and say, "Can't you see? I'm busy now. I'm talking to my daughter, Elizabeth." She and her father were skiing in Switzerland, moving down a steep slope side by side, with an icy wind whipping past them. And he suddenly fell and cried out with pain because his leg was broken. And she said, "Don't worry, Papa. I'll take care of you." And she skied down to the hospital and said, "Quickly, my father's hurt." And a dozen men in white jackets brought him there in a shiny ambulance, and she was at his bedside, feeding him. It was probably his arm that was broken, and then not his leg. And her mother walked into the room, alive somehow, and her father said, "I can't see you now, Patricia. Elizabeth and I are talking." Or they would be in their beautiful villa in Sardinia, and the servants would be away, and Elizabeth would cook dinner for her father. He would eat 2 helpings of everything and say, "You're a much better cook than your mother was, Elizabeth." The scenes with her father always ended in the same way. The doorbell would ring, and a tall man, who towered over her father, would come in and beg Elizabeth to marry him, and her father would plead with her, "Please, Elizabeth, don't leave me. I need you." And she would agree to stay. Of all the homes in which Elizabeth grew up, the villa in Sardinia was her favorite. It was by no means the largest, but it was the most colorful, the friendliest. Sardinia itself delighted Elizabeth. It was a dramatic, rock-bound island some 160 miles southwest of the Italian coast, a stunning panorama of mountains, sea, and green farmland. Its enormous volcanic cliffs had been thrown up thousands of years ago from the primal sea, and the shoreline swept in a vast crescent as far as the eye could follow, the Tyrrhenian Sea framing the island in a blue border. For Elizabeth, the island had its own special odors, the smell of sea breezes and forests, the white and yellow macchia, the fabled flower that Napoleon had loved. There were the corbicola bushes that grew 6 feet high and had a red fruit that tasted like strawberries, and the garcias, the giant stone oaks whose bark was exported to the mainland to be used for making cork for wine bottles. She loved to listen to the singing rocks, the mysterious giant boulders with holes through them. When the winds blew through the holes, the rocks emitted an eerie, keening sound, like a dirge of lost souls. And the winds blew. Elizabeth knew to know them all. The Mistrale and the Ponente, and the Tramontana, and the Grecate, and the Levante. Soft winds and fierce winds, and then there was the dreaded Scirocco, the warm wind that blew in from the Sahara. The Roffe villa was on the Costa Smeralda, above Porto Cervo, set high atop a cliff overlooking the sea, secluded by juniper trees and the wild growing Sardinian olive trees with their bitter fruit. There was a breathtaking view of the harbor far below, and around it, sprinkled over the green hills, a jumble of stucco and stone houses, thrown together in a crazy hodgepodge of colors resembling a child's crayon drawing. The villa was stucco, with huge juniper beams inside. It was built on several levels, with large, comfortable rooms, each with its own fireplace and balcony. The living room and dining room had picture windows that gave a panoramic view of the island. A free-form staircase led to 4 bedrooms upstairs. The furniture blended perfectly with the surroundings. There were rustic refectory tables and benches, and soft, easy chairs. Across the windows were fringed white wool draperies that had been hand-woven on the island, and the floor were laid with colorful terracota tiles from Sardinia and other tiles from Tuscany. In the bathrooms and bedrooms were native wool carpets colored with vegetable dyes in the traditional way. The house was ablaze with paintings, a mixture of French Impressionists, Italian masters, and Sardo primitives. In the hallway hung portraits of Samuel Roffe and Terenia Roffe, Elizabeth's great-great-grandfather and grandmother. The feature of the house that Elizabeth loved most was the tower room, under the sloping tiled roof. It was reached by a narrow staircase from the 2nd floor, and Sam Roffe used it as his study. It contained a large work desk and a comfortable padded swivel chair. The walls were lined with bookcases and maps, most of them pertaining to the Roffe Empire. French doors led to a small balcony built over a sheer cliff, and a view from there was heart-stopping. It was in this house, when she was 13 years old, that Elizabeth discovered the origins of her family, and for the first time in her life that she felt she belonged, and that she was part of something. It began the day she found the book. Elizabeth's father had driven to Olbia, and Elizabeth had wandered upstairs to the tower room. She was not interested in the books on the shelves, for she had long since learned that they were technical volumes on pharmacology and pharmacognosy, and on multinational corporations and international laws, dull and boring. Some of the manuscripts were rare, and these were kept in glass cases. There was a medical volume in Latin called Circa Instans, written in the Middle Ages, and another called De Materia Medica. It was because Elizabeth was studying Latin and was curious to see one of those old volumes that she opened the glass case to take it out. Behind it, tucked away out of sight, she saw another volume. Elizabeth picked it up. It was thick, bound in red leather, and had no title. Intrigued, Elizabeth opened it. It was like opening the door to another world. It was a biography of her great-great-grandfather, Samuel Roffe, in English, privately printed on vellum. There was no author given, and no date, but Elizabeth was sure that it was more than 100 years old, for most of the pages were faded, and others were yellowed and flaking with age. But none of this was important. It was the story that mattered, a story that brought life to the portraits hanging on the wall downstairs. Elizabeth had seen the pictures of her great-great-grandparents 100 times, paintings of an old-fashioned man and woman, dressed in unfamiliar clothes. The man was not handsome, but there was a great strength and intelligence in his face. He had fair hair, high Slavic cheekbones, and keen, bright blue eyes. The woman was a beauty, dark hair, a flawless complexion, and her eyes as black as coal. She wore a white silk dress with a tabard over the top, and a bodice made of brocade. Two strangers meant nothing to Elizabeth. But now, in the tower room, as Elizabeth opened the book and began to read, Samuel and Sardinia Roffe became alive. Elizabeth felt as though she had been transported back in time, that she was living in the ghetto of Krakow in the year 1853, with Samuel and Sardinia. As she read deeper and deeper into the book, she learned that her great-great-grandfather Samuel, the founder of Roffe & Sons, was a romantic and an adventurer and a murderer.